Now we're looking at the parliamentary format. Parley has 6 speeches. Those 6 speeches are given by usually 2 versus 2, a team of 2 versus 2. And the first one is called the Prime Minister's Constructive, and it's usually 7 minutes. The Prime Minister's Constructive is given by the first speaker of the government team or the affirmative team. And the reason in Parley that we say Prime Minister and government is because it's mimicking the House of Parliament, where the government, the ruling party, has a Prime Minister propose policies. So you as the judge in this case are the Speaker of the House, and you're organizing debate, and then you're also voting on what this House is going to do after the course of the debate has taken place. So the Prime Minister is the leader of the government team, and we'll give 2 speeches. The Prime Minister's Constructive and the Prime Minister's Rebuttal, the PMR, usually 4 or 5 minutes. Then there is the Leader of Opposition's Constructive. The Leader of Opposition's Constructive usually is 8 minutes. In different leagues, this varies. So that's the one in C from before. Then there's the Member of Government. MG is on the side of the Prime Minister, and they're giving a constructive speech. Then there is the Member of the Opposition. The Member of the Opposition is also giving a constructive speech, the last constructive speech. And then finally, there is the Leader of Opposition's Rebuttal, and you'll see again that there was a negative block right here, where the negative speakers went back to back in order to provide the affirmative, the first and last word. This tends to be a common theme in debate. Now that we've gotten all 3 formats out there, I have one more thing to say about this, which is that instead of there being cross-examinations, there are points of information. A point of information, or POI, is when someone who is sitting and watching on the other team stands up and says, point of information. At that moment, the person who is speaking has the ability to either grant that point and allow the person to speak and ask them a question or make a short point, or not. And they might say, not at this time, or no more questions, or at the end of this point, or later on in this speech. They have the full liberty as owning the floor to do so. It boosts their credibility to answer a few questions, but also sometimes the people asking questions are abrasive and it's not a good idea to answer their questions. So that can kind of be played out in each specific round. So you're going to see that points of information happen usually through the first 4 speeches. Now we get to something that is common across all the types of debate, which is that constructives are for making arguments, bolstering them, providing here is what the argument is, whereas rebuttals are for rebutting arguments already in existence. You as a judge are asked to ignore new arguments brought up in rebuttals. The reason for that is the idea of a debate is to have multiple turnarounds on an argument. So someone asserts and proves a point, someone counter-asserts and proves a point, then there's a reassertion and a reassertion and a reassertion, and by doing so you end up with a greater level of depth, or you ought to, with new facts and figures, new evidence and support, new logic and argument. That is what creates in your mind as a judge the ability to make a good decision when an issue has been debated back and forth. When an issue is brought up in rebuttals for the first time, there's not really opportunity to have a good back and forth on that issue. So that's why the constructives are provided to construct arguments and the rebuttals are not. And you need to ignore new arguments even if the teams don't point out that the argument is new. That's your job as a judge. However, you may see in the parliamentary format a point of order where the negative team, well, it could be either team, where the team sitting down says, point of order. When they do that, unlike the point of information, time stops. So the speaker will stop his or her timer, and so will the person on the team that's not up there who will also be timing the speech just to make sure everything's in line. And the person who made the point will say, this is a new argument because it was not brought up earlier in constructives. And then the person who is speaking gets a short chance to defend themselves and say, no, actually my partner made this argument here when she said X. Then you as the judge get to make a verbal determination, either point well taken or it's a new argument, or you say point not well taken, it's not a new argument, carry on, or point under consideration or advisement, which means you can't decide really if it's new or not, and you'll think about it and make a decision later. It's not really a big deal to you, and if you feel pressured, say point taken under advisement or consideration, but it really is helpful if you think an argument is new to say, nah, that's a new argument, so that the person speaking doesn't waste their breath continuing to prove what you're going to ignore anyway. After that has taken place, the time resumes and carries on until the end of the debate round. So that's what you're going to see in a parliamentary format. And don't feel too pressured about it because the debaters know how this works and they'll be able to help you through it. Now that we've talked about that, let's talk about one more element in terms of keeping track of the round and really providing the critique. We've talked about how to listen, and now we need to talk about deciding and critiquing. In deciding and critiquing, you usually have a ballot or a chance to provide oral feedback. So the ballot is going to be written and the oral feedback is going to be verbal, given at the end of the round. Here's what you're probably going to see. You're probably going to see a ballot that looks something like this. You'll be writing the name of each speaker in each of these boxes and providing individual comments to that speaker in the box. Then you will check who wins, government or negative, based on your decision on the argument. And finally, you will provide rationale for your decision and comments that are based on your opinion and what you saw in the round, and that will be a chance to provide feedback on things the debaters maybe missed or don't know. These all together are taken separately, and that's really the key that I want you to get across. There are 3 elements to your criticism and feedback. The first is, who are the best individual speakers? You'll probably be giving a number between 1 and 30, 1 being they didn't say a word, and 30 being they're Martin Luther King Jr., and that will help determine a ranking. If there's a tie, then you're also going to have to say one person, let's say you wrote a 29 here and a 29 here, you're going to have to mark one as first and the other as second. You always have to break a tie because in tabulation it doesn't really work to have ties. All these numbers will be on the ballot. You don't have to remember to do this. It'll be on there, and there's a place for you to do that. But the point is that there's a speaking competition, and there's an award for the best speakers at the end of the debate tournament. This is a separate award and area of critique than the arguments. The best argument that prevailed over the other team's argument needs to be judged independently of who speaks better or who sounds better. It needs to be who proved their point better and proved the resolution true or false better. That needs to be the key of the argument section. Finally, there's the opinion section below. I realize now that you can't actually see the bottom of the board. There's just some white space. The opinion section is where you provide what you think. So even if you felt like the arguments of one team prevailed over the arguments of the other, but you completely disagreed with the prevailing arguments, you still vote for the team whose arguments prevailed over the other team's arguments, and then write what you think about those arguments later. Any one of these 3 elements should be taken independently. The person that you agreed with the most might not even be the best speaker, the best arguers may not be the best speakers, or you may not agree with them the most, and so on. It could happen that you agreed with and found the best arguments and the best speakers in one team, but it doesn't have to be that way. It is crucial for you as a judge to differentiate between those three elements. Now let's talk about the next principle. The next principle is that the resolution creates the debate. A good definition of debate is two sides disagreeing on an agreed upon topic. So a resolution is phrased something like, the United States federal government should significantly reform its policy towards Russia. Or, this House believes it's time to withdraw the troops. Whatever the statement is, it is an active statement, and the affirmative team's job is to support that statement. The negative team's job is to oppose that statement. How this actually works is, if you were to visualize the statement as, let's say it's the United States should significantly change its policy towards Russia, you would visualize this as all the possible things we could do. So we could go to war with them. That would be silly. We could abolish the New START treaty with them. That would be silly too, probably. Or you could form a new partnership. Maybe that's a good idea. Maybe it's not. But the idea is, maybe you have a biodefense argument here. The idea is that there are multiple ways to affirm this resolution, and you're not saying that every policy with Russia should be changed, but a policy with Russia should be changed. What does that mean the negative team is doing? The negative team, in order to show that policy towards Russia shouldn't be changed, can't just say, oh yeah, all policies towards Russia are good. That doesn't make any sense. They have to wait and see what the affirmative team's case actually is, their specific example of why we should change policy towards Russia, then they're going to defeat that. So the negative team's job is to defeat the resolution, but they defeat it by defeating whatever it is that the affirmative team used to support the resolution. That's why you'll see them arguing against the negative case, but the affirmative case. But by doing so, they argue against the resolution overall. So let's talk about the three basic types of resolution. The three basic types are policy, fact, and value. A policy resolution is phrased as a decision or a course of action. So, X policy should be changed. A fact resolution is more evaluative. So, it does not have a change required in order to prove it. So, Walmart's business practices are detrimental. The key word there, of course, is detrimental, and everybody needs to agree on what Walmart's business practices are, but you don't have to actually say, and here's what Walmart needs to do about it, or here's what the government needs to do about it, as in a policy case where it specifically requires you to propose a policy. Instead, you simply are arguing, here's what detrimental means, here's how we decide, here are Walmart's business practices, see, they are detrimental. Then finally, under the value resolution, you end up with a specific named value is greater than some other specific named value when they conflict. Cultural unity ought to be valued above cultural diversity. I think I wrote this wrong probably. This will make sense if I go ahead and say X equals subjective. A subjective word like detrimental. Separation of church and state is being inappropriately eroded, would be a fact resolution. So under value, you're going to have some specific value pitted against another specific value, perhaps in a given context, like in foreign policy, realism ought to be preferred over liberal idealism or something like that. You are going to end up with a direct controversy. Each of these types of resolutions really are pretty much all you're going to see in parliamentary debate, where the resolution comes out 15 minutes